undeniable benefits of a managed data platform for open source technologies. So as people join, we have a quick poll asking you, where are you on your Kubernetes journey? So if you want to answer that question, it will just help us make sure we're tailoring the webinar to you. And again, if you've just joined us, we have this poll running now asking, where are you on your Kubernetes journey? So there's a few responses. So a few of the people are just spinning up a cluster, and the others are learning about containers. So we have a 50-50 split today. So today we have myself. I'm here to host this Kubernetes clinic with Steve Francis, who is the Chief Revenue Officer and Executive Vice President, that's a mouthful, Steve, at Instaclustr. Steve, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I have the world's longest title. Nice to be here, but I've been with Instaclustr for about 2 years. We specialize in open source data technologies, and our mission is to provide open source that's really open source so that our customers get the intended benefits of open source, which is namely that it's free, you don't have to pay license fees for it, and there's no lock-in. So excited to be here, and I don't think I will take up nearly as much time as we have scheduled, so I'll keep it brief, get straight to the point, and we should have plenty of times for questions along the way.
And if anybody does have questions, feel free to drop them into the chat, and I will interrupt Steve where needed. So before we get started with Steve, I just wanted to give you an intro to the Kubernetes clinics and Fairwinds. So Kubernetes clinics were started back in September with the idea of bringing people together in the Kubernetes community and giving some technical how-to webinars, help people to learn on their journey, be part of the ecosystem, and get a bunch of really smart companies and really smart people together presenting. Fairwinds is, we are a software and managed service company for Kubernetes. We are working to make sure Kubernetes is done right through our services. So moving on, I think I'm going to stop sharing, and Steve, over to you to start sharing.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm sharing my screen.
Yes.
You can see that?
Yes, I can.
Okay, success. All right, and it's maximized now. It's the slides taking up the whole screen.
Yes, looking
Cool.
Great.
Okay, thanks a lot. Steve Francis with Instaclustr, and our mission is to provide open source that's really open source, no license fees, no lock-in. And I'm going to take a little bit of a roundabout journey on why exactly a managed platform is the way to go. In many cases, it isn't in every case, and I'll talk about that too. But to get there, a couple topics I will focus on that are highly related to this is a little bit of a philosophical discussion about open source and the open source market, and how that market is evolving and how that's affecting people's ability to and their options for ultimately for how they deploy their technology. So specifically, the topic we'll cover today is managing the cost and complexity of the data layer. Instaclustr focuses on data layer technologies, open source data layer technologies exclusively. We don't do, presentation. We don't do business logic, and we kind of keep it to massively scalable open source data technologies. That's the segment that we focus on. So before I dig in to the topic that we'll be covering, I thought it would be useful to spend 2 to 3 minutes on who's Instaclustr, just so you know. This should shed some light on why these topics are important to us, and we have strong opinions about them. So anyway, for the technologies at the bottom of this picture, those are the things we specialize in: Apache Cassandra, Apache Kafka, Elasticsearch, Redis, Spark, and within a month, Postgres will be added to that list too. We've got some launches coming up really soon. So there's a handful of open source technologies that we work with, and that pie chart over on the left, that's basically the things that we do to help our customers with those technologies. So we have a consulting team, expert consultants for all of these technologies. We do support contracts 24/7, 365, and we also have a managed platform. So the managed platform should be differentiated from kind of a remote DBA service. It is not a remote DBA service. We truly have a managed platform with over 100 million node hours logged against it by our customers. The whole thing has a self-service console. It is also accessible through a RESTful API. So you can integrate the provisioning of these data services into your CI/CD pipeline. It's a really robust, mature platform, been around for several years. So those are the 3 services we provide for the technologies listed on the bottom, plus Postgres. Just a few things, these checkboxes here in the middle, are kind of what make our approach unique. So the first is we offer full life cycle support. We're not just saying we'll do the consulting for you, we will also operate it for you. So if you think of it in terms of an ITIL model where it's design, build, and run, we can help you at the design, build, and run stage. I mentioned before, it's 100% open source. There's no license fees and no lock-in. Third thing on the list is we're operators first. We may not be the people that wrote Cassandra or Kafka or Elasticsearch, but we are the people that have the most experience operating those technologies on behalf of our customers. So whether it's taking over operations in a managed service or being kind of a backup emergency support partner to our customers, operations is really where we specialize. All the builds that we use are certified and tested. And then finally, this last bullet point is a little bit subtle, but it's very important. So the way we support our customers is that we fill the gaps in these open source technologies with open source. So there are open core vendors out there who will fill those gaps by writing code and then charging license fees for that code. So this is going to be, DataStax, Confluent, Elastico, Databricks. That's what we call the open core model. They've got open core at the core of their offering, but then there's this kind of periphery of licensed technologies. The way we are different is that we'll go out to the ecosystem, the open source community, and find those, find open source alternatives to fill those gaps. And if they don't exist, we'll write it ourselves. So we will write an open source kind of platform completer technology and then support them or run them in our managed service so that our customers get a 100% open source solution that doesn't require any license fees. Okay, so that's what Instaclustr does. I just wanted to level set with that because it's maybe some useful context about where we're coming from in our philosophy. So let's talk about the data layer. The data layer has often been the most expensive layer of enterprise applications. Personnel is very expensive for data technologies. So is software, so is storage, and so is compute. And today, the data layer is commanding an even bigger share of the pie than ever before. So let's take a look at why that is. The first one's data growth. Back in 2010, 1.2 zettabytes of data was created on planet Earth. And so a zettabyte is a gigabyte times a trillion. So that's a lot of data that was created back in 2010. In 2020, 35 zettabytes of data were created worldwide. And IDC is forecasting that by 2025, 175 zettabytes of data will be created. That the numbers are just so huge. It's like thinking about the universe or the national debt. The numbers are they're just mind-boggling. And I think these estimates might be a little low because there's a couple factors to consider, like half of the world is still not connected. And there is a tendency when organizations get their hands on a lot of data, when people want to, do that overused phrase, digital modernization, digital transformation, it means they're a data-driven business, among other things. And Forbes observed that data begets more data. So once you've got a really great data set, you got another great data set, you want to see how they're related. And then there's maybe some external data set that's interesting and you want to kind of compare that. And these data sets spin off yet new data sets. So this is why we get this geometric growth. This is one of the reasons we're getting this geometric growth, in addition to just the huge number of sources of data with sensors and smart things all over the place, and Internet of Things, and just generally having smaller pieces of distributed technology instead of large individual pieces of technology that don't throw off as much data. So that's sort of what's driving the cost. So a popular way to address these ballooning costs at the data layer has been with open source. So other things have helped too. Like commodity hardware has helped, cheap disk has helped, elastic infrastructure has helped, so you only pay for what you're using when you use it. But with software, the costs are binary. It's either zero or not zero. So there have been some pretty colorful comments over the past decade about what's happening in the software industry. And there's three that I would like to share because I think that they capture the evolution pretty well. Famously, in 2011, Mark Andreessen said, software is eating the world, right? Most of us have heard this. A couple of years later, Michael Skoke from HBS said, open source is eating software. And not to be outdone, Adrian Bridgewater from Forbes in 2015 said, if software is eating the world, then open source will chew it up and swallow it. So open source definitely holds a lot of promise when it comes to reducing costs, but many open source users have found that the savings are elusive. Traditional software license vendors have lots of excuses for this. They often blame it on personnel costs. They'll say that it costs more to operate open source than it does to operate licensed software. But comparisons of Windows administration to Linux administration, or comparison of Oracle to Postgres, for example, don't bear this out at all. These studies have shown that they're very comparable in terms of the total ownership and administrative costs. So in reality, the unfulfilled promise is because most customers are actually still paying license fees for open source, which kind of defies logic, but we'll get into why and what that looks like and how to avoid it. Instaclustr believes that paying these fees isn't necessary, and it's really just a transitional or a temporary state in the market. And it's very similar to what happens in any industry that's facing massive disruption. So usually when a huge industry is disrupted, it finds ways to hang on to the old model as long as it can. So 130, 140 years ago, Luddites smashed textile looms to try to keep their weaving jobs. A really good example that's more recent is Kodak. They ignored one of their own engineers who developed a digital camera in the 1970s because it would have hurt film sales. They obviously went bankrupt. Much more recently, we had veteran taxi drivers in California who successfully sued Uber and Lyft for creating what they called unfair business competition. So the bottom line is that open source isn't really feeling like open source to a lot of users in the market. So let's talk about why this is and how to get the intended benefits of open source. All right, so we're getting a little bit of legalese, open source licensing kind of stuff here, but bear with me because this is very important. So our purpose here is to talk about reducing costs and the complexity at the data layer. And for this, I really only have one suggestion that it boils down to, and that's to have a strategy for choosing data layer technologies. There will always be technical debt. There'll always be brownfield to deal with. But by taking control of the greenfield, you can make incremental improvements that quickly add up. So the strategy we recommend is twofold. The first is to standardize on open source projects that have a permissive license. This ensures that nobody will start charging you license fees. The other suggestion is to standardize on technologies for a specific use case. In other words, try to avoid a one of everything type of architecture, or worse, which is quite common, a 4 or 5 of everything type of architecture. And this slide highlights the first one. We strongly believe in picking open source projects with permissive licenses. So permissive licenses offer broad free use and modification with minimal obligation. The most common of these permissive licenses today is Apache 2.0. And most technologies that Instaclustr works with are Apache 2.0. Next is copyleft licenses. Copyleft licenses were pretty popular 10 and 15 years ago. And put simply, what they do is they require any modifications to the code to be made public back to the community under the same license. So it's kind of, you can almost think of it as militantly open source, and that became a problem. And this is why it's not used as much, because what happened is corporations that were using this said, look, we're putting IP in here. We don't want to share it back to the community. This is kind of our personal, cherished intellectual property. So we've seen a big decline in copyleft licenses. Now, the third kind is the one we really have to watch out for. These are custom licenses. And these licenses are typically, permissive licenses are typically governed by a nonprofit institute or organization. Custom licenses are governed by an individual vendor. So they can do whatever they want. And a lot of these things are really open source in name only. It's kind of open source for marketing purposes is what I like to call it. Okay. There was big news last week. Last week was a pretty significant event in the open source community. Elastic adopted a custom license called SSPL. They abandoned a more permissive approach to licensing and took a very sharp turn toward closed source. So SSPL is the same license that is used by Cockroach Labs and MongoDB, and it is not an open source license. It's a really good example of something that open source users need to look out for. Moves like this will stifle competition, and control of a project will wind up in the hands of a single vendor. And when that happens, these vendors really start to feel to their customers like traditional software license vendors. they become open source in name only. So the Open Source Initiative published something on this. It's on their website. If you go to opensource.org, it's right at their front page. So they published something on this immediately within a day or two after the announcement, and they didn't mince words. So among other things, they said here, kind of at the bottom of this slide, it is deception, plain and simple, to claim that software has all the benefits and promises of open source when it does not.
So Steve, just to interrupt for a minute and ask a question. So so you choose an open source project, you're working on it, you have it built into your application, and suddenly this happens to you. Like, what do you do? What are the repercussions?
If something is licensed under Apache 2.0, this can't really happen. All somebody can do is make a fork, but the core, because it is the project is owned by a governing body that is a nonprofit, and there's many different stakeholders, this won't happen. So it's only when people begin to take baby steps away, or maybe the way they begin is not with a permissive license. That's why it's very important to begin with a permissive, widely understood, widely used type of license like the MIT license or the Apache 2.0, because the companies that deviate from that, it's a lot easier for them to make this sharp turn toward total closed source technology.
And where would I know I've been on GitHub and looking at different projects. Where would I get the information about the license? Because I know oftentimes, like,
it takes a little research. So a really good source, honestly, a good way to go shopping for open source software is go to apache.org. So apache.org is, it's the Apache Foundation. They have a list of like 200 projects that are licensed under Apache 2.0, which is a permissive license. Those are all pretty safe, right? You shouldn't encounter any of these kinds of problems with those technologies.
Okay, cool. Well,
okay.
I have a quick, Steve, I actually
go
have
ahead.
a question from one of our attendees. What is the difference between copyright and copyleft license?
So copyright is, you own it. It's not really an open source concept. Copyleft is an open source concept. And what it means is when you make a change, any derivative works from an open source project has to be contributed back to the open source project under the exact same license. So it's kind of, I think of it as like militant open source, because, and that's the problem. A lot of corporations say, look, we don't want to do that because the stuff that we build is, we want to own it. So copyright, it's not really an open source concept. Copyleft is, and what it means is derivative works have to be shared back with the community under the exact same license term as the original project.
Cool, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so on to the number 2 suggestion of our, very simple strategy I'm describing. Pick open source licenses that are permissive. The second part of that strategy is to pick technologies that serve a specific use case, right? We don't want 3 messaging technologies or 6 NoSQL databases or 3 in-memory databases, and that kind of one or many of everything can be unbelievably expensive to maintain. So our suggestion is to define a target architecture. Look at your needs at the data layer and think about, what do we need for relational? What do we need for NoSQL? What do we need for messaging, streaming, and memory, search analytics, high availability, and pick one. And there will be technical debt. It's not like you're going to suddenly have that be your target architecture in 6 months or a year or 2 years. It will take years, but the benefits accrue pretty quickly if greenfield opportunities for new data layer deployments stick to that model. It can be it's a great way to transform your data layer, which is, where a lot of costs live, like we've talked about.
So I have another question for you.
Yep.
So does derivative work means which we build, and I might not be reading it right. Derivative work means which we build custom on our own using copyleft licensed software. Not necessarily. We modify the source which belongs to them. Is that understanding right? And I might not have read that.
Yeah, that sounds like
Okay.
something that if you were to do that under a copyleft scenario, you'd have to contribute. Contribute that derivative work back to the project under the same license.
Okay.
If I understood it correctly.
If the person who answered it or asked that question wants to ask a follow-up, please feel free. Otherwise, Steve, keep going.
Okay. Okay, so I got into some detail there, but it's these are important details for having an open source strategy that actually gets you the benefits of open source. And this strategy that I described, the reason we think it's a really great strategy, surprise, it's a strategy that we used. So for our managed platform, we the two key remedies I suggested were to standardize an open source project with permissive licenses, and then open source projects that are suited to common use cases. In the cloud, this is exactly what Instaclustr's managed platform does. So our managed platform is, like I said, it's not remote DBAs. It is a true platform that has over 100 million log hours of operations logged against it with these technologies. And it's an automated way to provision and manage technologies like Cassandra, Redis, Kafka, Spark, Elasticsearch, Kibana, and coming very, very soon will be Postgres as well. We are kind of dipping our toe in the water of relational technology. So what this means is we do all the heavy lifting, right? We could do something like, if you want to operate these technologies, sure, we'll help you with consulting. We'll write you a support contract to be kind of a second line of defense. But with our managed platform, we take over all the operations on your behalf, on behalf of our customers. So we'll do the provisioning, we'll do the backup and restore, we'll do the securing of it, the patching, the upgrades, alerting, all of the heavy lifting. And so that is exactly the approach that we took, so that we wouldn't get surprised, and that our customers, the benefits of open source would flow to our customers and they wouldn't be stuck with getting any license fees. Now, while Instaclustr can help you on your open source journey in the cloud, we can also help with on-premise or hybrid deployments. So this is why we're partnering with Fairwinds. Partnering with Fairwinds, we're delivering Helios, and Helios is a unified control plane for open source data technologies. It's similar to our own cloud-based management platform that I showed you on the previous slide, except that our customers can run and operate this platform on their own in their own environment. Internally, we used to call it Instaclustr in a box. Like, we take our managed platform, put it in a box, make it available to customers. Helios can provide a unified solution to automate any of your data layer technologies, as long as there's a Kubernetes operator for it. So Fairwinds has helped us to architect Helios and is also our implementation partner when it comes to Kubernetes and deploying Helios. And so this is kind of our recommended solution for on-premise.
Steve, we have a question, which is, what is the hosting cloud for this platform? Is this your own data center? What are the deployment or provision options? And I know for Fairwinds, we're cloud agnostic,
Yep.
but I will leave it up to you.
Helios tends to be on-premise, because here's what we found. The previous slide, this is our cloud offering. We've had this for 6 or 7 years. We have hundreds of customers running on this one. But for customers who say, over the years, we've had a lot of customers say, for security reasons or regulatory reasons or political reasons, whatever it is, we cannot operate this in the cloud. We can't use your managed service in the cloud. But what people kept asking us is, can you just give us your managed platform so that we can run it and operate it ourselves in our environment? Well, the way our platforms are written wasn't really well suited to that. So we started building a new version of our platform that's based on Kubernetes to do just that. And so typically with Helios, we will run it on premise. Most of our customers are, it seems to be mostly customers that want to run this stuff on premise and have kind of their own internal private cloud managed service capability at the data layer, just to automate the provisioning, control, visibility, observability, and management of open source data layer technologies. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Of course. So just to wrap up, the three recommendations got into a fair bit of detail about why and kind of what market forces are driving this to be, a really what we consider to be a really valuable approach to your data layer. Standardized data layer around permissive open source licenses, define a target architecture versus a one of everything architecture. And then with the last couple of slides, specialize where it makes sense. If with a managed platform like Helios or the Instaclustr managed platform, you don't have to be an expert at Kafka, Cassandra, Kubernetes. We can do that for you. And so another important consideration is just, do we want to be in the open source operations business? Do we want to be, and so there's different ways that we can help you depending on your level of interest of how much of that you want to own and how strategic you may feel that is to you. But that is it. I kept it pretty brief.
There's another question, which is Helios is on-prem flavor of Instaclustr managed service built on Kubernetes. So I think
correct. That's correct. Great summary. That's exactly right.
Wow. That was one of the questions from our attendees. So I have a question for you, and it's around using databases with Kubernetes. So, we've talked a lot about the data layer and you're offering, and this using these open source databases. Do you have a view on when people come and they say, should we use persistent storage with Kubernetes?
I don't. That one's honestly kind of over my head, but specifically related to persistent storage. But what I can tell you is, the technologies that Instaclustr uses they're complex, right? Cassandra's kind of known for being complex to operate. Kafka is known for being complex to operate. And Kubernetes is also quite complex to operate. But if you're good at Kubernetes, and it can really help to simplify a lot of the scripting and do-it-yourself stuff that you ordinarily have to do to manage those technologies on your own. Specifically, though, about commenting on storage strategies and running open source databases in Kubernetes, I'm probably not the best person to answer that question.
Got it. Okay. So if there are any more questions, I have one more that came in. Are you aware of the DoD's Platform One initiative regarding their advocacy of Kubernetes and their open source offering?
I am not, actually. We partner, kind of our partner in crime for everything Kubernetes, and they're helping us to build and implement Helios is Fairwinds. So that would probably be a better question for Fairwinds.
So, and I can follow up with that question for the attendee after the Kubernetes clinic. So if there are any more questions, feel free to ask them now. Otherwise, we have a final poll that we wanted to ask our attendees, which is around what are your biggest challenges to deploying Kubernetes? And we do this because we like to just kind of understand where you're at in your journey. I'll just give you a minute to answer that. We have a few people who have answered complexity, and I get that because Kubernetes can be complex. That's one of the areas Fairwinds does help. We help take the complexity out of it by guiding you through getting Kubernetes done right. And then there's somebody who did say finding expertise. So that just maps out nicely to what I was saying about Fairwinds. So we are experts in Kubernetes. We've been 100% focused on Kubernetes for the last few years. And we have many resources, one of which I will bring up now, which is around the hidden cost of open source that you can get from our website. So the paper talks about, why open source isn't free, and it goes through some considerations around setup, maintenance, security, and reliability, and also talks about one of the pieces of software that we've developed called Fairwinds Insights, which basically is a bunch of open source projects that we put together in a platform that helps you check to make sure Kubernetes and your configurations are consistent, and your clusters are secure and they're reliable and they're cost effective as well. But you can check that out. We'll send a follow-up after this with the link to this resource. And then, if you have any questions for Instaclustr or any questions for Fairwinds, do definitely get in touch with us. And we have more Kubernetes clinics coming up. We will we'll let you know the next ones when they become available. So thank you everyone for attending, and thanks Steve for joining today.
Thanks a lot for having me, Danielle. And thanks, Dave, to you as well.